Hello and welcome to coverage of the Magic Online Championship. We're in Seattle, Washington. We're giving away a lot of money today, Luis.
Yeah, we are.
$25,000 up top for first place, but it starts here for these players. This is our first semifinal match between Niels Noorlander and Jonathan Anghelescu. We're playing Legacy. This was a decision that Jonathan had to make as the higher seed of which format to play first, thus guaranteeing that the format would be played, and also that he's going to be on the play in the format that we're playing here. And he decided to pick Legacy, which is no surprise to anybody that knows Jonathan, as he's really a specialist in Legacy.
And like I said before, this is a very interesting mirror because had Niels, if Niels was playing against another random Legacy deck, for example, he might just go for the turn 2 show and tell and put Emrakul into play. Playing against an opponent who has Emrakul, Gristlebrand, and Omniscience in their deck makes that a much more difficult play to make. And Jonathan's opening hand is quite good for this. He's got land drops, he's got Force of Will, he's got Spell Pierce, he's got a card that caused you to exclaim. That's an Omniscience. So that's enchantment that says you may play non-land cards from your hand without paying their mana cost. So he gets to play anything for free. And you're going to see both players develop their hand in the first couple turns with cards like Preordain and Brainstorm. That's a lot of kind of what this match revolves around, because you're trying to set up a hand where you can use sneak attack. That's the most effective way to win. Show and tell. Again, Niels could do something like cast Gitaxian Probe, look at Jonathan's hand. If the way was clear, cast show and tell. That would be fine. But, for example, what if he casts Probe here and he sees an Omniscience? If he plays Emrakul, there's a good chance he just loses next turn because Jonathan goes Brainstorm for free, Preordain maybe for free, find an Emrakul, find a Gristlebrand. All those things do not end up well for Niels.
Right, just basically ends the game on the spot. Now, when it comes to taking a look at the other player's hand, we see that there's a Gitaxian Probe in hand for Niels. Does Jonathan play that card? Does he have access to find out if the way is clear?
He does not. So he's not playing Gitaxian Probe. He's playing a deck which is actually a little bit more well set up for the mirror, which is funny because Niels based his deck on one of Jonathan's older lists. Mm-hmm. And you see Niels with the more typical sneak and show build with 4 sneak attack, 4 show and tell. Whereas Jonathan has the kind of the other angle of attack of this Omniscience and has fewer sneak attacks and has a slightly different card choices. One of the ways that Jonathan can win the game is Omniscience. So all his spells are free. Cast Cunning Wish. He has 3 copies of Cunning Wish, which let him select an instant from his sideboard, put it into his hand, and he can get Firemind's Foresight, the 7 mana instant that goes and gets a 1, 2, and a 3 mana instant from his deck. Get another Cunning Wish. Cast Cunning Wish as well as a Brainstorm. Cast Cunning Wish and get Release the Ants. and I know this all sounds ridiculous.
We're going deep here, aren't we?
Well, that's a 2 mana spell, which you can then play for free. Does 1 damage, and then if your top card costs more than your opponent's top card, it returns to your hand. And Brainstorm set it up so he can release infinite ants. So
because he can just keep casting it for free from Omniscience. Crazy.
Right. So
Jace the Mind Sculptor there.
Yeah, Jace is another really key card in this matchup because it's a win condition that doesn't expose you to casting show and tell, to putting your opponent putting something into play. Also, if your opponent did something like show and tell and Emrakul into play, you can go Jace bounce Emrakul. Emrakul is protection from colored spells, but that doesn't translate to planeswalkers in play. So this is not, despite these decks being capable of turn 2 kills or potentially even or earlier with like cards like Lotus Petal, Ancient Tomb, that we're going to see a lot of this in this matchup. Both players, again, they're using Brainstorm, they're using Preordain. You actually see Jonathan holding Brainstorm, and he may cast it this turn, but I wouldn't be surprised if he just waited to multiple turns to cast Brainstorm because he's just under no hurry. He's making his land drops. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot about maneuvering and then trying to resolve something like Sneak Attack or Jace rather than just the quick show and tell.
Niels has not played his land for the turn yet. Interestingly, if he wants to try to play Jace next turn, he'd have to play the Ancient Tomb in one of the next 2 turns.
Wow. All right.
Ooh, he's going for it.
It's because he cast Gitaxian Probe, and he knows that there is an Omniscience there, but an Omniscience plus a Brainstorm is not necessarily just enough.
Okay, so this is a big Brainstorm now for Jonathan.
Right. So had Jonathan found Emrakul or Gristlebrand, then I think Jonathan would just let this resolve. Mm-hmm. But because Jonathan has no follow-up here, I think he's forced to put 2 lands back and just spell pierce the show and tell.
Okay. He's got double Force of Will in hand as well.
And I like this play from Niels because it's risky. he could easily have lost the game on the spot. But if he's able to trade Show and Tell for a Spell Pierce, that's actually an advantageous trade in the mirror.
Why is that?
Because Show and Tell just becomes such a liability later.
Such a bad card.
Like
later.
Imagine Jonathan drawing a Show and Tell later, it's just going to do nothing. So Jonathan has a tough decision here. He's definitely putting back 2 lands. The question is, do you put back City of Traders, which is powerful. It taps for 2 colorless, but you can't play it until it's your last land, essentially, because whenever you play a land, you sacrifice it.
Right.
So I think that keeping City of Traders and a Scalding Tarn, I would be a little more inclined to keep a land that you can play instead of City of Traders, but it does make future draws of something like Sneak Attack a little bit more powerful.
Well, and the key interaction here being that in order to cast Spell Pierce, he has to sacrifice his fetch land, which is going to shuffle away whatever he put back.
Right. He Brainstorm, put back 2 lands. He's glad to sack his fetch land. That is the upside of Brainstorm for sure. And that's why you'll see these players often refuse to cast Brainstorm until they have a Scalding Tarn or a Misty Rainforest or Pluto Delta in play, because they want to shuffle back whatever their 2 worst cards are. Brainstorm it doesn't increase your hand size, right? You go from 3 cards to 3 cards if you resolve Brainstorm, but increases your hand quality dramatically, especially when you get to put your 2 worst cards back and then just start shuffle them away and just draw from your deck.
Jonathan is in the tank about whether it's a Spell Pierce, or I guess he's deciding if he wants to use a Force of Will for some reason.
His other decision is this a bluff Show and Tell? What if Niels doesn't have something? What if Niels has an Emrakul? I get to put in Omniscience. Then if I top deck, I just win on the spot.
Right.
But because remember, Jonathan doesn't know his top card anymore. It's very risky to let this resolve. If he's going to counter it, I would highly expect him to use Spell Pierce, because that's the card that gets worse later, and it's not a 2-for-1.
Whoa! He's
letting
it
resolve. So Jonathan has 1 draw step in. He drew Cunning Wish.
Whoa!
All right, so that was
he
definitely,
did it.
That was definitely the high risk, high reward play.
Oh
and
man!
Here comes the Cunning Wish.
And so now we're going to get to see that play that you described earlier. That sounded almost like you were joking.
I wasn't joking. The downside with that play though is that because Niels has Emrakul in his deck,
yes,
Niels can eventually clash, because Release the Ants do clash to the bottom and keep an Emrakul on top. And then at that point, Jonathan does not have a more expensive card than Emrakul. But Jonathan can now Cunning Wish for Intuition for 3 copies of Emrakul, play Emrakul with Omniscience, get an extra turn trigger because you are playing it from your hand.
And then he gets to be the first one to attack with Emrakul. Annihilator will go on the stack, and that'll be it. In fact, interestingly, Niels is at 15, or Niels is at 15 exactly.
And either way, Jonathan would have an Emrakul and Omniscience in play. So Jonathan really took a gamble there, but man, it paid off. He drew the Cunning Wish.
I can't believe he hit.
No gamble, no future. And in this case,
I mean, if he draws a land there, the game's over.
Yes, if Jonathan doesn't draw an action spell there, he loses.
Now, the interesting part, though, right, is that he doesn't know, like you said, you said this could be a bluff Show and Tell.
Right.
Like this could be Noorlander just picking a fight, because remember, Niels did get to see his hand. Like, he knew that he had Spell Pierce. He knew that he had a Force of Will. So it could just been like, here, counter this. We'll keep playing. Yeah,
and often you well, not often, but occasionally you will see players cast Show and Tell with no cards in their hand to put into play, because their opponent has to respect it. And the best part of all this, Niels did Gitaxian Probe, so he knew that Jonathan had a Brainstorm, and Niels didn't know that Jonathan didn't Brainstorm into that Cunning Wish.
Yeah.
But he's gonna later find out that Jonathan drew it. Like, I know he's gonna go back and find out.
Oh, you know he's gonna go back and find out. I have to say, Jonathan was pretty stone-faced too. I wonder if he was at home.
Yeah.
I wonder if he would have been like, yes.
Yeah. I don't know if Jonathan seems the type to be to be going nuts there, but I did enjoy that play. There's
a lot on the line.
Worth noting that with Omniscience in play, it's not that Jonathan needed to draw exactly Cunning Wish, but he could have drawn, if he draws Brainstorm or Ponder or Preordain, he gets to see a bunch of cards, and all his cards are free, so he can just keep doing that. So Jonathan has a very good hand, and this is why I believe his deck is advantaged in the mirror. He has Omniscience, and that is the trump card. So he can cast Show and Tells a little more freely than Niels can, even though at this point he's not just running one out on turn 2.
And he could have.
Partially he didn't, because he doesn't have a follow-up. He can put Omniscience into play and cast Brainstorm, but Niels would get to put a Gristlebrand into play. And remember, the cards off Omniscience are free, but they're not uncounterable. So if Niels had a counterspell for that Brainstorm, then or even just the Show and Tell, it would not work out well for Jonathan.
Yeah, or if just the Brainstorm whiffed. All right, so he's found a Ponder, so now we're going to see the setup stage that you talked about in Game 1, where both players are kind of going to jockey for position here and try to set up the best possible
And
hand.
Post board gets a little easier for Niels because, as you see in his hand, he has Through the Breach. Lets him, essentially, it's a one-shot sneak attack. It lets him put a creature into play with haste and sacrifice at end of turn. And he gets to side in 3 of those. And a big part of that is because Show and Tell's a liability, now he gets to have Through the Breaches instead. And that just lets him put a Gristlebrand into play, attack for 7, or just draw 7 immediately, then attack for 7, then draw 7 more, then draw 7 more, and set up either a win that turn or a win the next turn.
You said that, yeah, with the sneak attack, it just acts as kind of another copy of that. It's a one-sided way to get a creature in.
Right. And again, sneak attack is good because that's also one-sided. And Omniscience is the most powerful thing going on here. So Jonathan's inclusion of Omniscience is looking very good just because Omniscience plus cards like Impulse and Brainstorm let him just filter through his deck, find a Cunning Wish, and once he has Cunning Wish, he has a ton of different targets, and as well as cards like Through the Breach or Intuition. And then Omniscience lets Jonathan cast Emrakul from his hand, getting the extra turn, and that will go over the top of anything Niels can effectively do.
This is our first match of our first semifinal.
So Niels is pretty close to being able to go off here.
Okay.
He really wanted to. If he needs to find a blue card to go with that Force of Will, because if he does, he gets to go Scalding Tarn, Lotus Petal, cast Through the Breach with Spell Pierce backup and Force of Will backup.
Yeah, that's pretty tough.
But without having that extra blue card, it's not quite as enticing. He could also just use the Spell Pierce here on the Brainstorm, but it looks like he's really looking to save that to combine with his Through the Breach.
Looks like Jonathan's Omniscience flooded here.
Yeah, Jonathan is long on the enchantments, Omniscience, and Sneak Attack, and short on the creatures. He needs to find a Gristlebrand or ideally an Emrakul, because if Jonathan finds an Emrakul, he can go Show and Tell, Omniscience, Emrakul, and just win the game.
Right.
And note that Jonathan's in a somewhat risky position here because he doesn't have any counter magic in hand. So by casting Show and Tell, what Jonathan's looking to do, if it resolves, he's going to get to cast Impulse and Ponder both for free and see, 8 more cards. 4 off Impulse, Ponder gets 3, and then you shuffle and get 1 more just to look for an Emrakul or a Cunning Wish.
Okay.
So if you're Niels, this is really difficult to look at. Show and Tell is such a difficult card for both players. This is why this matchup is so hard. Niels can let it resolve and put a Gristlebrand into play, and then he'll have a Spell Pierce plus a Force of Will. Though Spell Pierce is a little less effective because Jonathan has 2 mana untapped and all his spells are free. So really, Niels is banking on that Force of Will, plus he gets to draw 14 cards off Gristlebrand. The problem is none of them stop Emrakul. Emrakul's uncounterable. So if Jonathan goes Omniscience Emrakul, then Niels can still lose. Even though we know, by looking at these hands, I believe Niels would be happiest to let this resolve, put Gristlebrand into play, and be heavily advantaged from there.
Wow. What a tough call here for Noorlander. He just has no idea, because like you said, if there is an Emrakul in hand for Jonathan, then the game's over.
And
wow, what a tough call.
Well, he has to have Omniscience plus Emrakul.
Yeah.
Just putting Emrakul into play, Niels would be happy with that.
Yeah.
Because Niels would presumably be able to find his own Emrakul on his turn.
Yeah, the getting an extra turn, of course,
but
being the difference.
Niels has to think, does Jonathan have Omniscience plus Emrakul? He just brainstormed. He cast Ponder earlier.
Wow.
This is one of those matches where not having complete information, it makes it really, really difficult to play because
you can see it too.
There's just combinations of cards your opponent has that you just straight up lose to. And even when countering it, so look, Niels cast Force of Will by pitching Spell Pierce. He could have paid 5 mana for Force of Will, but he didn't want to run into an opposing Spell Pierce.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just layers upon layers here.
I mean, so that worked really well for Jonathan right?
He has 3 Show and Tells in hand, and now he just got to use 1 for free.
And 2 for 1 his opponent. Wow, that's just great.
The downside for Jonathan is that Niels doesn't really have much left, so Niels is going to have to go for this Gristlebrand, and he has Spell Pierce backup, so it's actually going to work.
It's actually going to work now.
Because Jonathan is going to cast Impulse in response to Through the Breach, looking for Force of Will, but even if he finds it, Niels drew Spell Pierce and has 1 mana left over to Spell Pierce the Force of Will.
Totally. Here we go, Through the Breach.
So
Impulse in response.
Yeah, I would expect Niels to let the Impulse resolve because all he cares about now is Force of Will.
Right. Oh, this is huge.
And so Jonathan found Gristlebrand, so Through the Breach is going to resolve. Niels isn't going to win right now, but he's going to get to... He goes up to 22 off the lifelink, which means he could draw 21 cards, go to 1.
He'll probably draw 14 and wait.
Yeah, 14 ends up being a little bit better because you get to still cast Forces of Will.
All right.
Because all Niels wants to find is Force of Will now.
Right. Force of Will and blue cards. So let's see what he finds.
Plus, if he wants to set up a win condition for next turn.
There are no Force of Will in that.
No,
There's a Pyroblast and a Spell Pierce.
Niels could cast the Gataxian Probe here, but I think he's just going to want to draw 7 cards first because he doesn't actually have a follow-up next turn. This hand has Gristlebrand and Emrakul, but no sneak attack. There we go. Force of Will plus sneak attack. So now Niels is pretty set.
He has a land drop here too, right?
He does. He has not played a land. So now Niels is in great shape. He's going to be able to have Pyroblast plus Spell Pierce plus Force of Will up, or Flusterstorm instead of one of the other 1-mana spells. And next turn, he's going to have Sneak Attack plus Emrakul to finish things off.
Is there anything from Jonathan's side that he can do here? We look at his hand, and he's not going to be able to resolve a show and tell here through what Niels has drawn. But can he draw something with his draw step that can get him to that point?
So Jonathan is going to try to resolve show and tell, like you said. He could draw something like Flusterstorm. He does have one in his sideboard that he may have brought in because he doesn't want it as a Cunning Wish target as much as just having it. But that being said, Niels just has so many counterspells in hand. He drew 14 cards.
Right.
And one thing that his Legacy deck is good at doing is turning cards into counterspells even without a ton of mana.
Right.
Like 1 mana counter, 1 mana counter, 0 mana counter with 2 lands up. That sounds pretty optimal. Niels deciding which land to play here and what to discard down to. I would imagine he keeps something like Emrakul, Sneak Attack, and a bunch of counterspells. He could keep a second Sneak Attack if he wanted to, but it's not even that critical. He's not playing against a targeted discard, and he kind of assumes his 1 Sneak Attack is going to resolve. So maybe he keeps a second Sneak Attack if he wants to be safe. He could also keep, if he wants to keep City of Traders, but he wants to keep enough counterspells that he has 2 1-mana counterspells plus a Force of Will plus a blue card. And I don't think he needs the Gristlebrand either because Emrakul will presumably do the trick.
He just needs 1 big threat. He still has to discard 2 more cards from here.
Right. Would expect Gristlebrand to be one of them. Then the second one will either be Sneak Attack or City of Traders. And he's trying to decide which one is the least powerful creature. Also, he has to think about what happens if Jonathan resolves a show and tell, but in this case, I think he should be pretty confident that he'd be able to stop a show and tell.
Yeah. All right, he discarded the second copy of Sneak Attack and passed the turn back. It was Force of Will off the top for Jonathan.
And he had to feel good about that. That's one of the best cards he could draw. It just turns out, unless Niels decides to take a risk and let show and tell resolve here, it's not going to be enough. And I kind of can't imagine Neil doing that. Just
no.
He's got the game locked up if he untaps. Niels is just deciding which counterspell to use here.
It's going to be Pyroblast.
Basic Mountain does do a good job of telegraphing that one. And remember, the players have deck lists, so there's no, information loss here. Like, Jonathan knows that Niels has access to Pyroblast.
Mm-hmm. So is Jonathan forced to just counter here and cross his fingers?
He is forced to, yes. I mean, it's not going to work out. And if show and tell resolves, Jonathan's in. Actually, he's not even in insane shape because he can put Gristlebrand into play. He can go Omniscience into Gristlebrand, but if he uses Force of Will, he's going to go to 7.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be able to pay 7 life to Gristlebrand.
Yeah, he didn't tap that Ancient Tomb here to avoid that, but if he's forced to force, then it doesn't matter anyway.
And I think he will do this, but it's just going to be tough because Niels kind of has all the bases covered here. So here, Flusterstorm is pretty safe. It's got a storm count of 3, so you can just target the show and tell and make Jonathan pay 4 colorless mana for show and tell. And because Flusterstorm has storm, even if Jonathan had another counterspell, it wouldn't be possible for him to protect show and tell because there's 4 individual copies of Flusterstorm. Looks like Niels is just going to use Force of Will first, which also will work.
I think he changed his mind.
Yeah, I like using just Flusterstorm to start with, even though, again, Niels has a bunch of different paths to victory. I know some might even say that Niels has a bunch of different deterministic paths to victory because the outcome is certain from our perspective.
It does seem to be the case. All right, so here we go. Sneak attack. And once again, the way is clear here for Niels Noorlander to pick up game 2. Doing some pretty powerful stuff. He gets to make an Emrakul and attack with it.
Yeah, the only way Niels can let this one slip through is if he wants to make 2 Emrakuls and attack for overkill. That would not work out well, so I do not advise Niels to do that.
Yeah, those style points would be wasted in this case. So there's Emrakul. Hits the red zone, and that is going to do it for game number 2. So we're going to get a game 3 in our legacy match between Jonathan Anghelescu and Niels Noorlander. Remember, this is the first match of up to 3 between these two players in our semifinal. Since Jonathan was a higher seed, he got to choose which format of the 3 constructed formats to play first. He chose Legacy, which is his specialty. The loser of this match will get to pick the other one, the next one?
No,
or
the second seed. Niels will get to choose the second format. The interesting part about the whole interplay between choosing which formats is that Jonathan isn't forced to pick his best format. Though if he doesn't and he loses round 1, then Niels gets to choose round 2. He could be in a spot where he doesn't ever get to play Legacy. So picking Legacy first is by far the safest.
Players are wrapping up their last sideboard measures here. One of these 2 gentlemen is going to be in the
notice
finals.
There's 4 show and tells in Niels' sideboard there. So
he just took them out.
Yeah, he's not. Through the Breach is just the better plan for that, whereas Jonathan gets to leave show and tells in. So again, Jonathan I think has the deck that is more well suited for this pseudo mirror match because of Omniscience, but it's still they're playing a lot of the same cards and it's still a very close matchup.
All right, let's take a look at the opening hands from our players on the top. Jonathan, wow, a lot of ponders and a lot of Force of Wills. He's kept that, and he's going to kick things off with a ponder on the bottom side of the screen there. Looks a little more varied for Niels Noorlander.
Niels has a hand that's short on counter magic, but pretty good otherwise. A lot of what you're looking for in the early game with these decks is being able to develop your mana, have multiple lands, and being able to cast cards like Brainstorm and Ponder and Preordain so that you can set up the hand that has like 1 creature, 1 kill condition, and a bunch of counter spells.
Wow, there's a show and tell off the top here for Jonathan.
Whoa, Jonathan, he could just go for it. He could just cast show and tell. And he has double Force of Will backup because if he first he'll start by going force pitching Ponder if Niels has a counter, and then if that works, he goes Omniscience Emrakul. If Niels has a second counter, he can go force pitching Omniscience. And Jonathan doesn't go for it. He has to be afraid of Flusterstorm. That's the card that you would fear in that spot. But it's funny because Jonathan made such an aggressive play in the first game, letting Niels' show and tell resolve, and here he's opting for the safer route of waiting on the show and tell.
Right off the top there for Noorlander is Griselbrand. So now he does have a threat to go with that sneak attack or the through the breach.
And I think that I wouldn't be surprised if he chose to shuffle away the one of those 2 things. You see what Jonathan just did there? He tapped 3 mana, indicating he has Cunning Wish in hand, and then undid it. You are allowed to bluff on Magic Online, as it turns out.
That's pretty cool.
So if you're Niels, you think, why would you tap 3? Oh, he has Cunning Wish, and then Jonathan decided, actually, no, I'm not going to cast it now. Jonathan doesn't have Cunning Wish in hand. He is just running the bluffs.
Nothing that costs 3 mana at instant speed. So good stuff from Jonathan. Do you think that'll change anything from Noorlander's side?
I don't know how it will impact his play, but it has to put the idea in his head. And I like that Jonathan's range includes trying to demonstrate that he has these cards.
I mean, I have to say, just looking at Niels, he is deep in the tank here.
Well, I think part of that has to do with the Brainstorm.
Yeah, I know, but
so
I think he has thrown a little wrench into the works here.
So Niels is, again, he can put back either Sneak Attack or Through the Breach. Sneak Attack is better because it stays in play and it costs comparable amounts of mana. 4 + 1 is the same as the 5 for Through the Breach. But Through the Breach has the advantage of you can cast at the end of your opponent's turn. You can just end of turn, cast Through the Breach, put a Griselbrand into play, untap, attack with it, and it's not sacrificed until your end of turn. So, looks like Niels is, for that reason, potentially putting back the Sneak Attack. And then Gitaxian Probe is pretty interesting in this matchup because it does give you a way to plan around their cards like Spell Pierce or Flusterstorm, the conditional counter spells, or have a sense of how close they are to killing you. So there's a good chance that Niels wants to keep the Gitaxian Probe for that reason, which would kind of force him to put back one of the other cantrips. He has 3 different cantrips in hand, so either Ponder, Preordain, or Brainstorm, with Brainstorm likely being the most valuable. And Niels also has the option of not sacrificing Scalding Tarn. He could wait. And if you're going to sacrifice it, on upkeep is the best way because you have your Volcanic untapped. So kind of expect things to kick things off here with the Gitaxian Probe. Now he gets to see that there's no Cunning Wish.
Yeah.
So now he has more information about what Jonathan's willing to do. He's like, why did you tap 3? Oh, okay, you have nothing. Interesting.
See, and the crazy part about this too is that they're sitting right next to each other. Like
Yeah.
I might look over my monitor like you, but Niels is a little more businesslike. He's just writing down the hand.
Ooh, an Ancient Tomb, a very good draw. So because Niels is short on mana here, he knows that Through the Breach just won't resolve. I mean, he could cast Through the Breach, but Jonathan would just force will it. So Niels, his options are play the Ancient Tomb, say go, and go end of turn Through the Breach. So at least if Jonathan counters it, Niels untaps all his mana, or continue developing his hand with cantrips, with cards like Preordain.
Yeah, it looks like he's going to go for the Preordained side of things. Okay, he finds another Through the Breach. And he's going to be content to just pass the turn back. Volcanic Island off the top for Jonathan. And he's going to kick off his turn with a Ponder. Jonathan still doesn't have information about what Niels is working with.
And on that Ponder, Jonathan's looking at Gristlebrand and Show and Tell. And he might want to pick up an extra copy of his win condition, so it looks like he's not going to shuffle. So I wonder if Jonathan goes for it. Looks like he's still waiting. He's not willing to play into Spell Pierce, it looks like, or even Flusterstorm. I would expect Jonathan to want to shuffle the Gristlebrand away with Misty Rainforest, though. One of the strengths of Ponder and Fetch lands, of course, is you look at 3, choose the best one and draw it, and then you shuffle away the other ones.
And that's what he's doing. Brainstorm off the top for Jonathan. And these players still remaining quite patient.
Yeah.
Neither of them have gone for any big play yet.
And you'll see this a lot in the mirror matches, just because if you tap out to try to go for something and it doesn't work, your opponent has all their mana up on their turn, and this isn't one of those control matchups like you see in Standard where you can resolve a Haymaker, then your opponent resolves a Haymaker, and then you go back and forth. Here, as we've seen, the first person to resolve a big creature is going to win.
It's just game.
Though I suppose in the case where Niels resolved Emrakul and Jonathan resolved Omniscience, it actually worked out for Jonathan. But that's part of why his deck is built the way it is.
So he's just going to play that Brainstorm in his main phase.
Him playing Brainstorm in his main phase, actually, that's interesting. It could make him more likely to go for it because then he could put back Gristlebrand and Scalding Tarn if he wanted, and then he can go cast Show and Tell, play City Traders, cast Show and Tell. If it doesn't work, cast another Show and Tell, have Force of Will for the second Show and Tell. But it looks like, again, Jonathan is choosing the more conservative route.
Mm-hmm. Does this favor one player or the other the longer the game goes? By the way, we have an end step here.
Yeah,
Through the Breach.
Because Niels has found a second Through the Breach, he's got an advantage here. He can cast a Through the Breach. Jonathan, if he casts Force Will for 5 mana, which he does have the option of doing that, Niels can Spell Pierce it. Then Jonathan's forced to force again. So it is a lot riskier to spend the mana here.
Okay, looks like he's not. He's just going to do Force Will the easy way.
So this is kind of interesting for Niels. He's going to want to... If he draws a Force of Will, he's in very good shape. Because he's able to cast Through the Breach with Force Will backup. Even if he's not, he could cast Through the Breach here. Jonathan either has to spend 5 mana for Forceful, in which case it gets Spell Pierced, and Niels basically wins. He gets to Emrakul Jonathan down to like 0 permanence. Or Niels goes Forceful, pitching one of my cards, and then he's unable to win on the next turn.
Look at that Brainstorm.
Yeah,
Spell Pierce and a Flusterstorm in there.
So now I think Niels is in really good shape because now Niels gets to put back Ponder plus whichever creature he doesn't want to Through the Breach into play.
Right.
Play Ancient Tomb, cast Through the Breach.
And have 2 mana left over still?
And have 2 mana for Flusterstorm plus Spell Pierce,
Wow.
which combine, especially with the Brainstorm, with the Storm count of Flusterstorm, to be able to force Jonathan to pay more mana than he has available.
Yeah. Wow, we could see Niels Noorlander stealing match 1 from Jonathan. This is Jonathan's home turf here. This is Legacy. This is where he's played. You say it was 3,500 matches?
Yeah, that was the stat.
Wow.
And interesting, again, I keep going back to the fact that in Game 1, Jonathan let Show and Tell resolve, hoping to top deck, did top deck Cunning Wish, won the game. A very daring play, which worked out quite well for him. And then this game, he could have just jammed turn 2 Show and Tell with double force backup, and he declined to do so.
Yeah.
It's funny. I mean, I'm sure he has reasons for why he took a risk in Game 1, didn't take a risk in Game 3, but it would have worked out better in this game, I believe, given the composition of Niels' opening hand.
I'm letting Niels resolve his Brainstorm. You can see he's deep in the tank. I am curious, though, Luis, are you more willing to take risks like that when you're up a game?
No, that doesn't change things.
I know people think it does, though.
It shouldn't. It's tempting because when you're up a game, you're like, well, I'll take this risk, and if I win the match, and if I lose, I've got another game.
That's exactly the mindset that people have.
Right, but you should make the play that gives you the highest percentage chance to win the game you're in, regardless of what the external factors are. It's like, but if I win, I'll be in top 8. It's like, well, you should play the same if you're 0-2 as if you're 4-0.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a fallacy, as something that your brain tricks you into thinking that it's better to do that in that scenario. It didn't trick Jonathan, though. It may have been better for him to do that looking back.
Yeah, it's hard to make these calls against an opponent with 7 unknown cards in hand.
Very difficult.
Certainly not faulting him for not taking risks. I just think it was interesting that he took a very big risk in Game 1 and it paid off handsomely, and then he didn't do it in Game 3. And I think this long game, it's going to end up in Niels' favor based on the way the cards are laid out right now.
Yeah, here we go. Here's Through the Breach. That's going to get Force of Willed. He's going to pitch Omniscience.
And it's actually up to Niels now. Does he want to go all in? Because he needs to use Spell Pierce and Flusterstorm in order to force this through. Because the Flusterstorm itself wouldn't be enough. But now that he forces Jonathan to pay 2, then he gets to Flusterstorm it.
He's doing it.
If Jonathan has a Spell Pierce or a Flusterstorm, then Niels' Through the Breach doesn't resolve. But I think we're going to see an Emrakul attack set Jonathan down to 0 permanence.
Yeah.
Note, it's not going to end the game.
It's not.
No, Jonathan is going to be at 2 life. And Niels and have no cards in play, but except an Emrakul and a Show and Tell in hand. Niels is just going to have a Ponder in his hand.
Interesting, and then, so he has to find a win from there. You know, I like Niels going for it here, though, right? Because let's say that this does get Spell Pierced. That means that Jonathan only has 1 card left in his hand, right? It's like it's going to be very difficult for him to actually beat you from there.
Yeah, at the end of the day, sometimes you have to go for it, and in this case, I think Niels. I like the way he played this turn.
So where does this go from here? So all the permanents go away for Jonathan. He goes down to 2. You can see his hand there. There's a Ponder in hand for Niels. He needs to just build back up to threat plus way to put in a threat. Is that his whole game plan?
Essentially,
it goes down to 1. Actually.
Jonathan actually sacked a Scalding Tarn to itself, not to the Emrakul trigger, which puts him at 1 instead of 2. It's kind of unfortunate. So basically, we restarted, and that Ancient Tomb doesn't do anything because Jonathan's at 1. Basically, we restarted the game, except Jonathan's at 1 life and has no cards in play. And Niels has 7 mana in play and a cantrip in hand.
So how does this end?
Niels just he has to find Through the Breach or Sneak Attack plus a creature
plus
again.
Any creature. Okay.
And Niels is very far ahead here.
Yeah.
It's not over because Jonathan can just draw land, but because Jonathan's at 1, cards like Scalding Tarn and Misty Rainforest don't work, and Ancient Tomb doesn't work. So Jonathan doesn't have that many actual mana sources in his deck.
Oh, that is unfortunate. So
we're at 10 mana, by the way, with that City of Traders.
Oh no,
the Emrakul countdown has begun.
Okay, well, tick-tock.
And remember,
11.
Niels can't play the City of Traders till last because it sacrifices. Jonathan drew City of Traders. If Jonathan draws a blue source that doesn't cost him life, he's going to be able to cast Show and Tell next turn and just put Emrakul into play. Oh, there's the
Through the Breach, though, for Niels Noorlander. And this ought to do it. He's got plenty of mana to pay for any potential Spell Pierces. And wow. Yeah, that does it. Oh, you see the big fist pump there for Niels. He knows what a big win that was for him. And especially, I mean, I have to go back to it. You know, this is Jonathan's home court. This is his specialty. He 3-0'd Legacy. That was the first first round that we played back on Friday, and this is his specialty. Picking up a win here is a big deal. Now we're going to let the players take a quick breather, and in fact, we're even going to get a word with one of them in just a minute. But that gives us a minute to sort of take a deep breath and decompress here as well. That was Legacy. Now we still have Modern and Standard available, and it's going to be Niels Noorlander's choice. We'll get a chance probably to hear from him about what it is that he's actually choosing for that round. But do you have any thoughts on it, Luis, as far as, I mean, you know the list that they're playing. Do you have any sense for what Niels should or might be doing?
So Niels has his choice of either playing 4-color Cryptolith Rights against Naya midrange, or playing Infect against Naya Zoo. And my inclination, having not tested these specific lists, would be to play the Rights deck against Naya midrange. But one thing that that kind of tilts me in that direction is that if play draw is based on the winner of the last match, then Infect, you want to be on the play with Infect a lot more than what you do in Standard. So if you choose Standard now and you win, then you won the match. If you lose, then you get to be on the play with Infect in match 3.
Okay, yeah, so interesting stuff. Again, we're running one semifinal, then the next one will be after all this is over, and then we'll have the final, so you're getting to see all of it here. But BDM is ready with Niels Noorlander right now.
Thanks, Marshall. Niels, that went exactly according to plan, right?
Well, I didn't really have a plan for this Legacy match because I thought the match was really bad and I couldn't beat him in the long game. So that's why I tried to jam in the first game. Didn't work out in the first game, but second and third the cards fell right, and pretty great that I won the Legacy match.
Now that was your actual worst format during the Swiss rounds, right?
This was my first Legacy match that I've won. So yeah, I would say it was the worst format. Yeah.
A real David versus Goliath moment. Now, there was a situation where Jonathan, when you'll watch the replay, you'll see he could have actually played like a turn 2 show and tell.
I saw his hand. I mean, if he went for it, I was dead all the time, I think. So I was like crossing my fingers, please don't do it. And then I can end of turn through the breach and maybe get through there. And it worked out. I totally didn't expect it to work, but it did.
It's a little bit of a game of chicken when you're playing Legacy.
Yeah, well, I think usually you want to be the last one to act in these counterspell matchups. So I think that's why he chose that plan. But in this spot, he had so much counter backup for his show and tell that it would have just resolved, and he would have Omniscience Emrakul, and I would have been a gunner.
So you're up a match. You head into the next set of games, and you get to choose the format. Yeah. What format will you be choosing to play in round 2 of these 3 semifinal rounds?
I've chosen Standard for this one because I really want to be on the play in Modern. So if I lose this round, I can play in the Modern in the third match.
All right, Niels, thank you so much. Good games the rest of the way here in the semifinals.
Thanks.
Welcome back to the booth here at the Magic Online Championships. We just saw the first match of the semifinals between Niels Noorlander and Jonathan Anghelescu. Niels actually took the match in Legacy, and Jonathan had chosen it.
Yeah, he was able to sneak in a win there thanks to a number of counter wars and then, of course, through the breach.
Mm-hmm. And actually, it sounds like Niels has chosen Standard for our next match here. And if you guys were watching previously, our Standard deck list, it looks like Niels is going to be on the 4-color Rights deck. And for Jonathan, what's he playing?
Jonathan is playing Naya midrange. So this is the kind of deck that, as someone who is an avid fan of 4-color Rights, I've been playing a lot of the deck, you kind of do want to play against these decks. You like playing against decks with Sylvan Advocate in them. So I'm not really surprised that Niels chose to play this matchup, and I think it goes back to wanting to be on the play in Modern if things go poorly. So here we have a look at Niels' deck list, and it's the game plan here is really just combine Collected Company and Cryptolith Right that puts a bunch of creatures in play, and then you use all that mana on Duskwatch Recruiter and Eldrazi Displacer, these powerful activated abilities. It has the combo too. If you have Brood Monitor plus Eldrazi Displacer plus Zulaport Cutthroat in play, you sack the 3 Eldrazi Scions to use Displacer on Brood Monitor, getting you 3 Scions again. You just keep doing that, and your opponent loses 1 life per Scion.
Yeah, we saw that happen a lot in the Standard matches when those were going on. Can we get a look at Jonathan's deck list now? And you were talking about how he's playing the Naya control list. 3 Nahiri, the main planeswalkers here.
And when you're playing the Cryptolith Right deck, you're going to look at this deck list and you're going to, what are the cards I'm worried about? You're worried about Atarka. Atarka is effective. You're worried about Radiant Flames, of which there's only one in the main deck, though 3 more on the sideboard. And you're not that worried about cards like Nahiri or Stasis Snare or Silk Wrap. These 1-for-1 removal spells aren't very effective against a Collected Company plan. Jonathan also has 4 Archangel Avacyn, but he doesn't have that many different ways to actually trigger the flip condition, which is having a non-angel creature die. So Jonathan needs to use something like Radiant Flames to kill his own creatures to flip Avacyn, at which point the Radiant Flames already do the work, so it's a little tough.
Yeah. Now, who do you think is going to be favored here going into the second match of this semifinals between Niels and Jonathan?
I believe Niels is ahead, but because this is Standard, I don't think that it's like by a huge amount. Standard tends to have closer matchups than other formats.
And of course, if we do go to a third match, if Jonathan does win this Standard match, we are going to have Modern. So we'll see if that's going to be the case, or if Niels can win 2-0. Let's take a look at some of the Modern decks. So if we do go to that third match, Niels is playing Infect, and I think you were telling me that Infect only lost to the Mirror yesterday. Is that
right?
correct?
There were 2 Infect decks, and they went 7-1 with the loss being to the Mirror. We saw Niels actually beat Jerry Thompson in the last round to make top 4. He pulled out a very close victory.
Yeah, and actually, speaking of Jerry Thompson, after this semifinals match is done, we'll be watching the semifinals between Alexander Ivanov and Jerry Thompson. So you guys are going to want to stay tuned for that as well. Jonathan's on Naya Company for Modern.
Right, so he's kind of got almost the equivalent in both formats, where he's got this company. This case it has companies, but it's this Naya mid-range deck, and he's trying to company into cards like Loxodon Smiter, Knight of the Reliquary, which the 4 Lightning Bolt and 4 Path are tough for Infect, but the creatures themselves are not that big of a threat.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like the players are ready, so let's go down to the second match of this semifinals between Niels Noorlander and Jonathan Anghelescu. All right, and as we can see here, welcome to the semifinals match, second semifinals between Niels Noorlander and Jonathan Anghelescu. We have Reflector Mages and 4-color Rights on Niels' side, Nahiris and Naya on Jonathan's. Let's join the match here and see what we got. Okay, let's take a look at these opening hands. I see lands and spells. Luis, what do you see?
It looks like a solid hand from Niels' perspective. He's got Cryptolith Rights into Eldrazi Displacer, and he's got that Brood Monitor as the high end. Jonathan has a very solid hand, too. He gets to go turn 1 Oath of Nissa and play Sylvan Advocates on turns 2 and 3 with potentially a Silk Wrap to take care of whatever Niels plays. So it looks like Niels is deciding whether to mulligan, and Niels, in fact, did mulligan that hand. And this hand is a lot more interesting because he basically traded a bunch of lands in a Cryptolith Rights for 2 more creatures, which is what he's looking to do in this matchup.
Yeah, as you were mentioning, the 1-for-1 removal on Jonathan's side, not necessarily the best thing versus this 4-color Rights deck, but it seems like, an Eldrazi Displacer or a Catacomb Sifter are fine targets for that.
So Jonathan currently deciding between Archangel Avacyn and Cinderglade off of his Oath of Nissa here, and he's gonna go with the Avacyn.
Okay. Still missing his second white source, but he does have time for that. Land off the top here for Niels.
And Niels is going to play this turn on Loam Drive, but he's really looking for a 2-drop here, because if he can play a 2-drop, then his game plan gets started a lot sooner, and Loam Dryad is going to be active here. This is this is the 1-drop mana accelerant we have in Standard right now, and it's seeing a lot of play.
Yeah, we've been talking about Loam Dryad a lot. Nobody expected it, and then you were mentioning yesterday that, well, you can go through a lot of hoops just to get that Birds of Paradise type effect.
Yeah, we one of the breakthroughs when we were actually testing for the Pro Tour, because we did play a Cryptolith Rights company deck, was realizing that Loam Dryad was just good. And it's not a card that on its surface looked like a standard staple, but it certainly has become one.
All right, a second Sylvan Advocate here for Jonathan, as you can see. Once he has 6 or more lands, it's going to get +2/+2, and that also gives his land creatures +2/+2. Needle Spires can become pretty spicy once Sylvan Advocate gets turned on there.
Yeah, once you have a Sylvan Advocate giving Needle Spires +2/+2, or in this case +4/+4, you double strike attack for 8 damage or 12 damage.
Catacomb Sifter the play here for Niels, who actually has a nice follow-up. Eldrazi Displacer and Brood Monitor, perfectly fine options here, but it looks like Jonathan's actually going to go ahead and use that Silk Wrap, I would assume, on the Catacomb Sifter. Now, this is probably pretty good for Niels, I would expect.
Yeah, Jonathan is using Silk Wrap, like you said, on the Catacomb Sifter in order to be aggressive to attack with these Sylvan Advocates, but he's not really. And this is the thing. Jonathan's deck is not really well suited to do the last 8 points of damage. So he can get Niels down to 12 or get Niels down to 8, and maybe try to sneak it in with Avacyn. But Niels is happy to trade a Sifter for a Silk Wrap, get a token, or be left with a Scion in play. And this next turn, he just drew a Collected Company, so he's just able to slam that instead.
Yeah, the Brood Monitor and Eldrazi Displacer getting some good company here. Well, the second white source for Jonathan means he's going to be able to flash in Archangel Avacyn at the end of a turn.
And because he has this Avacyn, he's confident in making this attack, even though Niels will get to cast Company mid-combat. Jonathan then gets to play Avacyn now and make his Advocates indestructible. So if Niels finds like an Eldrazi Displacer and blocks an Advocate, I would expect to see Avacyn come down and save the Advocate with her triggered ability.
We'll see what this Collected Company finds for Niels.
So he's choosing between Eldrazi Displacer, Catacomb Sifter, Elvish Visionary, and Duskwatch Recruiter. I don't know if I've ever seen a company hit 4 different creatures, at least not when I've cast one. So it's an unfamiliar place, but getting 2/3 drops is exactly what you want out of Collected Company.
Well, it looks like Niels is going to go to Displace as well as a Catacomb Sifter.
And note that Niels actually has the ability to use Eldrazi Displacer right now because he has 2 Scions plus that Loam Dried. So if things go poorly, he can do that. Instead, he's just going to go block. He could also block with a Scion on an Advocate to try to kill it, but he's got to be aware that Jonathan has 4 Avacyn in his deck. So if he does that and Avacyn comes down, it's going to be less good for Niels than if he didn't.
All right. Well, looking at this position in the game, do you think Niels has kind of stabilized from where he once was, and maybe even ahead now?
Oh, Niels is actually very far ahead because what's going to happen here is Avacyn's going to save the 2 Advocates. That's fine. Next turn, Niels can play a Brood Monitor, and he's got the combo going because he's got Eldrazi Displacer, Brood Monitor, and the key part is...
Oh, my God.
He had Catacomb Sifter to scry infinitely, but it's just better just to draw Zulaport Cutthroat if you're going to choose to do that. So he actually has exactly enough mana to play Brood Monitor, play the Cutthroat. He has to spend 5 mana here, plus one of the Eldrazi Scions, play the Brood Monitor, and then play Cutthroat, and then just win the game on the spot.
Oh, he's actually tapping. Oh, he has a Loam Dried, of course, for that additional black. This is turn 5, remember, folks.
Yeah, this worked out quite well for Niels Noorlander. Oh, and of course, chat's pointing out that Oath of Nissa actually revealed the Avacyn, so Niels, of course, was playing around.
Ah, right.
I think it would have been right to play around it either way, but given that it's face up on the screen, it makes it even easier.
All right, and there's the Brood Monitor. Loam Dried producing a black source. And, wow, turn 5, perfect mana, perfect draw.
Well, I mean, this is Niels putting on a clinic of how you win tournaments. And he did mulligan a hand that I think is a hand that a lot of people would have kept. So I like that his play got rewarded.
So that just tells you that he was probably looking for very specific cards, and I guess he found them.
All right, and Jonathan is going to concede the game.
That was a turn 5 kill in Standard here, folks. 4 color rights versus Jonathan's Naya mid-range. We can take a look here at the players' sideboards. What kind of things can we expect from Jonathan's side?
He's going to want to bring in Radiant Flames and Tragic Arrogance. Basically, the sweepers, having more copies of ways to sweep the board does make it so cards like Cryptolith Rites are less effective, and you can kind of see Niels, deciding how many negates he wants or transgresses, and he's doing it. He's bringing the Reality Smasher sideboard plan, or at least some amount of them, because Reality Smasher and Sylvan Advocate give Niels a way to win the game despite the presence of cards like Radiant Flames.
Silk Wrap not very good versus Reality Smasher, although Natarka could definitely take one out one shot.
Yeah, and Natarka is still going to be good in this matchup, even though it's a little slow. Looks like Jonathan trimming cards like Avacyn and some of his Nissa, just like the kind of like slow mid-range cards that the Rights deck doesn't really care about all that much.
Remember, folks, this is the second match of this semifinals between Jonathan and Niels. Niels is currently up a match. They played Legacy in the first one. Here we are with Standard. Now, if Jonathan wins the next 2 games here, we will go to a match 3, which will be our last unplayed format, Modern. But I assume Niels is feeling pretty good here. He's up a game. He's already up a match.
If Niels wins this game, then he's on to the finals.
Yep, that is correct, and you will have your first finalist if that is the case. And remember, right after this, we're going to have the semifinals between Jerry Thompson and Alexander Ivanov. We'll see what kind of things these players still opting to move around their cards. Yeah, and remember, this is the biggest Magic Online tournament, you know.
This is the Magic Online Championship, and as you're saying, they're playing for very close to the caliber of Pro Tour level prizes. I mean, this is the Magic Online Pro Tour.
Yes.
And the winner will become platinum. Will be invited to the World Championship. We'll get to play at next year's Magic Online Championship. So what's at stake here is very large, and I'm sure both players are feeling it right now.
All right, just the last few changes over here for Jonathan's side. Looks like Niels content with his board. Looks like we are ready for a game 2 between Niels Noorlander and Jonathan Anghelescu. This is the second match of their semifinals. Niels is currently up a game.
Well, it's a great draw for Niels. He's got turn 1 Lone Dryad. If he draws an untapped land, he can play Visionary into Catacomb Sifter. If he can also just, if he doesn't draw a land, untapped land, just go turn 1 Evolving Wilds, turn 2 Elvish Visionary. But he's just got Catacomb Sifters and Duskwatch Recruiter, so not a draw I'd be looking to mulligan. The other hand, Jonathan was forced to mulligan and now has a hand which does have a turn 3 Radiant Flames into Nahiri and Avacyn. So turn 3 Radiant Flames, very good start. Niels is aware of the fact that Jonathan has 4 copies of Radiant Flames, so he is going to be keeping that in mind with Jonathan forced to take a land off of this Oath of Nissa.
It looks like Niels did draw that second untapped mana source for turn 2, so he's able to play out a Duskwatch Recruiter if he wants to, or an Elvish Visionary in this case.
I tend to play the deck a little bit more conservatively, whereas against a removal-heavy deck, I'd want to play an Elvish Visionary here, and then try to play Duskwatch on turn 5 or turn 4 if you have 5 mana, because you can play Duskwatch, and even if they kill it, you get to activate it once, replacing itself, finding another Duskwatch, because you're really trying to grind out your opponent here. Turn 5 kills notwithstanding, this ends up not being as much of a race as an attrition war.
We'll see what Niels wants to go for. He has quite a few options here.
The thing is, if you play Duskwatch, it is a higher reward play, but I like playing Visionary here.
Okay, and that is the play that Niels is in fact going to go with. Going to get a fresh card off that Visionary. It looks like it's a Westvale Abbey. How good is that card in this matchup?
It's solid. It's not as good post-board because there's so many more Radiant Flames running around. And against a deck with Stasis Snare and Soulcrap, it's a bit of a liability. But it is still a threat, and sometimes you can actually just pay 5 and start making 1/1s that can help power your like Cryptolith Rights and that sort of thing.
Now, we saw the same position yesterday where the opposing player had the option to cast Radiant Flames when the Rights deck had potentially 4 mana next turn, of course, off of that Lone Dryad. So is this a scenario where Radiant Flames is something that Jonathan's going to be considering?
So one reason for Jonathan to play Radiant Flames here is that he's got a 4-drop and a 5-drop. So even though this is a 1-for-1, remember, the Elvish Visionary replaces itself, I think that's the safest play for Jonathan by far.
Okay, and Niels continuing to draw lands for his draw steps.
So the first land was great. The second land was good. The third and fourth lands were not good. So Niels was like, come on land. Yes, come on land, I guess. Now, no, stop. No more land. So his deck listened too strongly here.
All right, Nahiri, the Harbinger, coming down on Jonathan's side.
Let him cash in that Evolving Wilds for something else.
Well, the Evolving Wilds evolved into a Stasis Snare of all things. And like we had mentioned, the 1-for-1 removal not necessarily at its best here, but you can get rid of those pesky, Eldrazi Displacers, Zulaport Cutthroat type creatures.
Yeah, and here we can see Niels. He can smash the Nahiri down to 3 with his 2 creatures, and not really too much about Nahiri using her -2. The question is, what do you play next? You can play another Sifter. You can play a Lone Dryad. You can play both. You could also play Sifter plus Duskwatch Recruiter, though that's really just putting all your eggs in one basket against a Radiant Flames. But because Nahiri and then Avacyn do pressure you, and Niels doesn't know about the Avacyn, but he does have incentive to start playing out creatures because you can't play around Radiant Flames forever. And if he plays too slowly against a Planeswalker and Avacyn, he could just lose with a bunch of creatures in his hand. So kind of expect to see him play multiple creatures this turn.
And that is correct. Lone Dryad and Catacomb Sifter going to hit the battlefield here for Niels. And we're going to see Nahiri fall down to 3 loyalty.
Yeah, and she's not going to be able to stabilize the board here by herself, but she can,
Oh.
I was going to say she can help find a Radiant Flames, but I guess a Radiant Flames has been found. If Jonathan's worried about Scries, he could -2 Nahiri to exile the tapped Catacomb Sifter, then cast Radiant Flame, because I assume if you cast a Radiant Flames right now, then Niels, he's going to get to scry 8 times, 2 off of each of the non-Catacomb Sifter creatures, and then 1 off each Sifter, because they see each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot of scries. That will find him a collected company most likely, or something like Reality Smasher. Reality Smasher actually be really good here because if Nahiri plus 2s and then he casts Radiant Flames and Niels finds Reality Smasher, it can just take down Nahiri.
Yeah, I think Jonathan's probably going through that in his head right now. We'll see if he wants to exile the Catacomb Sifter. No graveyard shenanigans for Niels' side, so...
Jonathan taking a slight gamble, discarding his 5th land in order to keep the Stasis Snare on the Avacyn, but he's going to ultimately he has to cast Radiant Flames here. It's just a much better play than the other two.
All right, and as we see, we're going to get 8 Catacomb Sifter triggers on the stack.
All right, let's see what Niels is looking for. He's going to put land on the bottom. He's going to put land on the bottom. He's going to put land on the bottom. That's a lot of lands in a row. He's also declining to draw Elvish Visionary or Cryptolith Rites. And there's a Reality Smasher. I think that's the card he's looking for.
Yeah, especially with his 5th land untapped in hand already.
So he's going to put 3 Reality Smashers on top.
Wow.
Or actually just the same one 3 times. But
I
still.
mean, we can hope.
He would. I think Niels would sign up for 3 Reality Smashers in a row.
I definitely think so in this scenario. All right, Reality Smasher smashes in, takes down Nahiri the Harbinger.
Well, as you mentioned during sideboarding, Stasis Snare is a pretty good option against Reality Smasher because it comes into play, then exiles it, and you don't actually have to discard a card.
Looks like he's... Oh, right. Of course, both have flash, so doesn't necessarily need to play it anything main phase.
Oh, a cool interaction here. Dramoka's Command does get rid of Stasis Snare, except there's that Oath of Nissa kind of hanging out in play and protecting the Stasis Snare from Dramoka's Command.
Oh.
Though Avacyn here is not going to work out quite as well because Niels is going to be able to fight Avacyn with the Reality Smasher and put a ++1 counter on it if he wants to.
Yeah, that just seems like a great lineup here for Niels Noorlander. In fact, he can even cast the Duskwatch Recruiter right afterwards.
And that will put Niels firmly ahead because that Stasis Snare is likely obliged to trade for Reality Smasher, at which point Duskwatch Recruiter against an empty hand with both players just doing nothing and Duskwatch being activated is very good.
All right, well, Avacyn trigger goes on the stack. This is Niels' chance to respond before Avacyn gains Indestructible.
And one thing that would, if I were Niels, push me in the direction of doing this is because Oath of Nissa is in play, you're not going to be able to nab a Stasis Snare with Dramoka's Command. So the utility of Command has gone down a little bit, so I'd rather just get 6 points of damage and kill that Avacyn.
Unfortunately for Niels, 6 and 5 don't actually speed up the clock here unless he opts to produce an Westvale Abbey token at some point.
And notice that Niels decided not to play the Duskwatch Recruiter, again going back to wanting to play it when he can activate it in the same turn.
Mm-hmm. All right, just a land and a pass from Jonathan, who's still holding that Stasis Snare. Needle Spire's not too bad, though. A Sylvan Advocate draw would make that a pretty hefty Spire. Of course, this can turn into a 2/1 double striker.
Oh, man. Had Niels used the last command to make Jonathan sacrifice Oath of Nissa, then this Dramoka's Command would have worked. But I don't think he should have, but it is funny that would have ended up working out.
Yeah, the downside of that, of making Jonathan sacrifice the Oath of Nissa, well, the Reality Smasher would have died to then Atarka at that point. So.
Yeah, also true. Oh, that was a good draw for Jonathan. Silkrop is going to take out the Duskwatch Recruiter, and again, Dramoka's Command unable to save it. Jonathan also gets to get in for 4 here, which is relevant because Niels is going to fall to 10 once he uses this Duskwatch Recruiter. The Llanowar Wastes, Yamai Coast, and Caves of Koilos do add up.
All right, a Sylvan Advocate the hit here, and with 6 lands, that's going to be a 4/5 Vigilance.
Yeah, that's not bad. That can keep the Needle Spires back and attack at the same time.
All right, so Niels Noorlander falls down to 6 there from attack from Needle Spires. Another land to draw for Niels.
The good thing is the way Niels sideboarded is he ends up with a lot of powerful, expensive cards in his deck. So he could just draw another Reality Smasher, or he could draw, Duskwatch Recruiter. Oh, there's a Chandra. So, well, Chandra can't actually kill the Sylvan Advocate. Making 2 elementals isn't bad, but you end up, I guess what's going to happen is if so Jonathan makes 2 elementals, attacks, Niels blocks one with a Sylvan Advocate, goes to 3, and then Chandra's 5 loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
So Niels actually going to use Dramoka's Command here to make Sylvan Advocate into a 5/6 in order to take down the Chandra. Or at least that's a play that he can use to do that, and he might fall to either 1 or 2 depending on which lands he taps for it. because he can do it on his main phase. He doesn't have to do it in a turn.
Mhm. Of course, if Niels fights the unblocked elemental, then his Sylvan Advocate is going to die as well.
Right, so that would be a reason not to do that, even though it is tempting. It's like block one, fight the other, but fight actually does damage back to you. So yeah, Niels is going to decline to do that. Well, I think Niels is still ahead here, just not by very much.
Yeah, that Needle Spire is actually lethal by itself now.
I would be tempted to wait on Dromoka's command. Falling to 1 here means you can never tap any of your other lands for colored mana.
Uh-oh. I thought Niels for a second was going to use that Dromoka's command and accidentally kill his Sylvan Advocate.
Yeah, that would be unfortunate. Another pain land. Oof.
All right, well, I think Niels has definitely got on the back foot here. Jonathan looking in great shape.
Well, Jonathan needs to draw something because Niels is going to be able to kill this Chandra, and then Jonathan is now facing down a 5/6. Niels could actually go to 1 if he wants to use Westvale Abbey,
Sure.
by the way. And then now if Jonathan doesn't draw anything, then Sylvan Advocate will go over the top. But
How's a Stasis Snare?
a Stasis Snare is good. If Jonathan waits, Niels could actually draw Negate, so it's slightly risky to wait here. But Niels really just needs to draw Collected Company. That's the card that would, I think, put him in a pretty good spot, assuming he hits well. Because that Needle Spires is going to come calling soon.
All right, and the draw for Niels is going... Oh, it's going to be an upkeep. Stasis Snare.
Yeah, which is the same
As main phase.
As main phase. The only reason it's not is that it doesn't give Niels the information. So he may have chosen to use Westvale Abbey as opposed to not.
Right.
Tragic Arrogance not at its best when you have 3 enchantments in play, which is not the normal case, but it is funny that Jonathan did draw that here.
And that's probably in from Jonathan's sideboard, I would assume.
Yeah, it's a very effective sideboard card, but in this case, all it would do was make Jonathan sacrifice 2 enchantments.
Well, in this instant here, Loam Dryad is the lone Dryad, as it's going to probably, well, actually just sits back, I guess. The Needle Spire's kind of preventing anything from going on here.
Well, Jonathan has an interesting call here. He could attack with Needle Spires, and if he does, Niels is going to use Westvale Abbey, go to 1, make a 1/1, double block Needle Spires. It can first strike down one of the 2 creatures. The other one takes down Needle Spires, and then we have a clear board with Jonathan at 13, Niels at 1, and only able to tap for blue or green mana because all of his pain lands, his caves and wastes and coasts, can't tap for colored mana anymore.
So is that something that Jonathan might want to do to take care of the Loam Dryad?
Well, it ends up trading for both creatures. I actually kind of like it from Jonathan's side because more than getting rid of the creatures, it means that Niels can't cast something like Catacomb Sifter or Eldrazi Displacer if he draws it. The downside is, and the reason I think Jonathan is not doing this here, is that if he draws any removal spell, then he gets to win with Needle Spires.
All right, looks like Jonathan's just going to go ahead and pass. Niels draws a Catacomb Sifter for the turn, and this, just like we were talking about, now he can cast it.
Yep, now he's able to go to 1 by tapping his caves or his Llanowar Waste for black. And because the Loam Dryad is in play, and this is the other reason I guess killing Loam Dryad is beneficial, is now he has access to any color mana thanks to Loam Dryad. Tragic Arrogance still not looking spectacular here.
Stasis Snare number 3.
I mean that's a relevant card, but it's not going to destroy Niels here. I guess Jonathan can Stasis Snare the Loam Dryad if he wants to keep Niels off of mana, but that doesn't seem very effective either.
I think he's just content just with passing back. Forest, actually not a terrible draw, I assume.
It's the only card it really makes live is Brood Monitor, so yeah, Niels would rather just draw pretty much any spell at this point. Certainly better than drawing a pain land.
Ooh, Gideon, Ally of Zendikar, the draw here for Jonathan.
And Jonathan can set up a win here pretty soon, or he can try to. If Niels taps down too low or taps too many of his creatures out, he gets to Stasis Snare a blocker and then attack. Then negate a turn too late because now Niels can attack Gideon with the Catacomb Sifter, but first of all, that doesn't kill it, and second of all, Jonathan could just Stasis Snare it if he wanted to.
It looks like Jonathan's going to go for the end of turn Stasis Snare here. And that's probably going to be negated. I mean, it would leave Niels dead otherwise. Oh, okay.
So Niels is allowing the Catacomb Sifter to go down, and Niels actually does die to just activate Gideon, activate Needle Spires. It's kind of it's hard to pass up the ability to negate when you're pulling those 2 cards in hand, going into 1 card in hand. just because how many targets do they really have? But looks like we're gonna see a game 3 here.
Yeah, activation of Gideon, ally of Zendikar, gonna make him a 5/5. Activation of Needle Spires, and 3 creatures are gonna bash into the red zone. Niels, with only 2 blockers, can do nothing but take lethal. And Jonathan's gonna win the second game here of their second match. We're playing standard. We're gonna go to a game 3. Currently, Niels Noorlander up a match. They're even in this match, 1-1 currently. And, after this semifinals, ladies and gentlemen, we have another semifinals to show between Jerry Thompson and Alexander Ivanov. So looking forward to some more exciting magic here. Any different sideboarding for play versus draw?
So currently, Niels is kind of like hedging. He's got 2 Reality Smashers in his deck, 2 Eldrazi Displacers in his deck. So he's not full on putting all the creatures in, but he's also putting some of the big creatures in. He's taken out all the Cryptolith Rights and the Zulaport Cutthroat and the Brood Monitors, which I generally tend to favor setting out the combo. It's just hard to decide what combination of big creatures you want. After seeing that game, I would be tempted to bring in Enlightened Ascetic, the 2-mana 1/1 that destroys an enchantment. Niels chose not to, but freeing up one of your creatures from a Silk Wrap or a Stasis Snare seems appealing.
It looks like the players are done sideboarding, so let's jump down to a game 3 here between Niels Noorlander and Jonathan Anghelescu in their second match, which is currently standard. Let's take a look at these opening hands, and just like last time, Jonathan with a lot of enchantments.
Oh, this is a great draw for Niels. He's got turn 1 Loam Dried, turn 2 Sylvan Advocate, turn 3 Collected Company. So Jonathan is likely going to Silk Wrap the Sylvan Advocate, but it's still a turn 4 Collected Company is not bad.
Yeah, this is great development. Players playing rather quickly here. Loam Dried getting in the red zone. Going to drop Jonathan down to 19.
That's mainly what it's there for, is to attack on turn 2.
Nobody beats a 1/2 on turn 1.
1/2s have been among the most powerful creatures in Magic.
This is true. It's no Deathrite Shaman, but Norwood Ranger does some good work.
Stoneforge Mystic, though Nahiri playing more of the Stoneforge Mystic role. So Silk Wrap it could actually take out the Loam Dryad, but if you take out Sylvan Advocate, you kind of make it so Loam Dryad doesn't tap for mana anyway, so that's already good enough.
Elvish Visionary, not a bad draw here for Niels, who just wanted something to do this turn.
Yeah, Elvish Visionary quite good.
Also lets him develop out the Evolving Wilds.
Elvish Visionary is a great card.
Right.
And Niels not going to have the problem he had last game. He's not taking much pain off his lands. He's got a forest and island. He can Evolving Wilds for a swamp, and then he can just be set.
Oh, but right off the top again, right on time for Jonathan Anghelescu, Radiant Flames.
This one is a little less bad for Niels. Actually, I think he'd be happy for Jonathan to cast Radiant Flames, because next turn he can just cast an end-of-turn Collected Company, and he lost a 1/1 and a 1/2. He didn't actually even need the mana from Loam Dryad. So this... Jonathan's probably happy about that top deck, but Niels is the one who should be happy about the top deck. See, because now Niels is just going to pass with 4 mana up. He's now deciding whether to get Swamp or Plains, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And Jonathan's going to be like, all right, I guess I play Nahiri and plus it, and then if Niels hits off his Collected Company end of turn, then that's going to be good enough to take down Nahiri. He would have to, I guess, hit Sifter plus some combination of Sifters and Displacers, which is difficult to do in his current setup.
And remember, Jonathan has 4 Radiant Flames potentially after sideboarding. He has 3 in his sideboard, 1 in his main deck, and, well, as we've seen the last few games, he's drawn them readily and handily. Reflector Mage, not an awful draw. I mean, as long as it's a spell, I assume, but like you said, Collected Company going to be the end-of-turn play.
Yeah, and into this obvious company, do you even play Nahiri? Jonathan has to decide that. It's not unreasonable just to pass with Nahiri. I mean, he is going to run it out, but I think that there is some decision there.
Alrighty, and a turn for Nahiri the Harbinger. Draws Jonathan a Sylvan Advocate, who also drew Radiant Flames for the turn, but we'll see what this end-of-turn Collected Company can hit.
It hit exactly what Jonathan or Niels needed to hit. It hit Displacer plus Sifter. That gives him 6 points of power, lets him attack Nahiri down.
Lone Dryad the draw for Niels on his next turn. And I assume we're going to see all of the creatures hit the red zone, taking out Nahiri.
Though that second Radiant Flames draw from Jonathan is pretty key, because now he's able to Radiant Flames for 3. It takes out all of Niels' board, and Niels can't even add another creature to his board right now. Niels will get to scry off of the Catacomb Sifter, and he can actually use Eldrazi Displacer to blink the Sifter first to get an extra Scion, giving him 3 scries total. But this is still... not a great spot for Niels just because he's got a board developed here, and Jonathan's gonna be able to kill your board and play a Sylvan Advocate.
Actually, does he have potentially 4 scries? If he sacks the Scion and then for mana and uses it.
Oh, he can scry addition. He can use Displacer an additional time. So that's and even a 4th scry.
And Neil's just thinking, do I want to play out another creature? How many Radiant Flames does he have?
I think he's just trying to blink the Sifter now,
Oh, okay.
just to make sure it resolves.
Yeah, and he can still get the 4 scries.
Another Radiant
Wow.
Flames. All right. Well, if you draw 3 Radiant Flames in a game, you're going to do pretty well against Collected Company.
Jonathan stone-faced as ever. And then we see the second Radiant Flames of this game.
And Neil's deciding he needs to do better than Catacomb Sifter. He scried Catacomb Sifter to the bottom. When you have a bunch of scries in a row, your bar should also be higher. If you're scrying once, maybe you keep Catacomb Sifter, but given that you're going to get to scry 4 times, you're in a lot better shape if you just wait and try to hit a couple different creatures.
All right, let's see what he scries.
Yeah, Reflector Mage to the bottom, and then gets one last scry here off of the Displacer and Land Our Ways to the bottom. So Niels does not know what he's drawing next turn.
Sylvan Advocate, the follow-up to that Radiant Flames. Pretty good turn for Jonathan there. Elvish Visionary, the draw for Niels.
So Niels has 2 different lines of play here, really. He can go Visionary into Reflector Mage or Visionary into Catacomb Sifter. And they're both decent. I like starting with Visionary because it just gives you more information. And you can decide where to go from there. Though I guess he has to decide which one he wants to cast depending on how he taps his mana here. Since if he taps Swamp, then I would expect him to be casting Reflector Mage.
Cave of Koilos, not the draw he was particularly looking for, but he still has a few options left. We'll see if he goes with the Sifter or the Reflector Mage. Well, looks like he's going to play out the Lone Dried in addition.
And this sets up perfectly for the 3rd Radiant Flames.
Force the draw for Jonathan. That's going to turn the Sylvan Advocate on his next turn into a 4/5. Of course, he can't replay it this turn because of the Reflector Mage, but holding up Stasis Snare and casting Radiant Flames here. Radiant Flames here seems pretty good if he can. Oh, actually, I guess he can't do that, can he?
In order to kill the Reflector Mage, he has to tap one of his white mana, but it's actually not guaranteed that Jonathan needs to cast Radiant Flames here. He's been pretty good about just wiping the board immediately when given the opportunity, but what is Niels going to play next turn that really punishes you for not casting Flames? You take 4 damage. That's the downside. The upside is Niels might just play another creature. He's unlikely to play around the 3rd Radiant Flame. So I think this is the decision that Jonathan has to face here. Also, if you leave mana up for Stasis Snare, worst case scenario, Niels plays a Reality Smasher, and you just get to Stasis Snare it.
And both players at 18 life here in their 3rd game of their 2nd match. This is standard. If Jonathan wins here, we're going to go to Modern, where we'll see some more Anaya from Jonathan and Infect from Niels. It looks like Radiant Flames is the play. Oh, but a Collected Company off the top for Niels.
That was a great draw. So now Niels can actually play Catacomb Sifter and then sack the Scion, scry, and then play Collected Company. He'd likely be doing this at the end of Jonathan's turn, but it is an option available to him. It looks like he's just going to... He doesn't want to give up the token value. He thinks that the grind is too important here, so he's going to just play the company end of turn instead.
Ooh, as far as land draws are concerned, Jonathan drew a pretty nice one here. Needle Spires, and again, we mentioned it previously in the earlier game, but with Sylvan Advocate, that can become a 4/3 double striker.
All right, company medium whiffs. Unfortunately for Niels, he gets to put 2 Reality Smashers on the bottom, and his only 2 targets were Duskwatch Recruiter and Loam Dryad. And now Jonathan's going to take advantage of the fact that Niels can't use the Recruiter to Stasis Snare it.
All right, and we're back to Niels drawing some lands. Catacomb Sifter now.
Yeah, this is a really close game. Jonathan is certainly ahead. Niels has good draws available to him, but right now Jonathan is the one with the lead, especially because that Needle Spires is a 4/3 double striker.
All right, we're going to see a few back and forths here as both players have drawn a land for their last few turns.
I wouldn't be surprised this turn if Niels chooses to chump block the Needle Spires with the Eldrazi Scion, and then instead of taking 8, take 4 from the Advocate, and then get to scry off the Scion.
And indeed, we do see that.
Evolving Wilds is going to be heading to the bottom, so Niels needs to top deck here. He's got a couple turns. Oh, well, that was really big. Right now, Eldrazi Displacer is set up to take over the game. Currently, Jonathan does not have an answer to it, and Niels is going to get to use it. Looks like twice this turn. What he can do is he can blink his Sifter and then use the Sifter, the sign from the Sifter. He can block the Needle Spires and then blink the Sylvan Advocate, or just block and then blink the Sifter again. He's got a couple different options.
Yeah, Deathcap Cultivator, not exactly the draw Jonathan was looking for. A lot more relevant cards left in his library, but like you mentioned, this Displacer should just start taking over the game. He's going to start scrying. He's going to start producing, more Eldrazi Scions.
Oh, and Jonathan choosing not to attack with the Needle Spires. So now I think you just block with the Catacomb Sifter and then blink it. Yeah, so what this is going to do, like you said, is it gives Niels the ability to just scry multiple times a turn, and he can actually sack the Scion to scry and then blink the Sifter again with Displacer, so he gets basically a free scry. Thanks to Lone Dryad plus Swamp plus Eldrazi Scion.
We'll see if he wants to take that line at the end of turn, and it does look like, in fact, he's going to do so.
All right, this is Niels' opportunity. He's got a couple turns here of free displacering, and he needs to turn that into a measurable advantage. Right now, he's looking at a Catacomb Sifter and deciding whether he wants to keep it. I would be inclined to keep it. And one reason that is because it gives you double scries on every Scion. That just lets you rip through your deck and find cards like Sylvan Advocate or Reality Smasher. But the downside is it doesn't actually add that much to your board because you can already pay 3 mana to make a token.
Mm-hmm.
So Niels chose not to keep it, but draws Reflector Mage.
And on this board state, I would say that's a pretty darn good draw. Of course, Eldrazi Displacer can do the same thing it's been doing to Catacomb Sifter, flickering the Reflector Mage just to bounce everything back to Jonathan's hand, and of course he cannot recast it on his following turn. Yeah,
Niels is hoping that Jonathan doesn't draw his 4th copy of Radiant Flames or a Chandra, but if he doesn't, or like an Atarka, Jonathan has a lot of big draws, but if he doesn't, this is going to be a pretty fast clock. Note the Deathcap Cultivator does not even have Delirium right now.
3 card types currently in the graveyard for Jonathan. He's got a land, sorcery, and planeswalker. Well, 3 sorceries in this case, but all of the same variety.
Niels deciding whether he wants to attack or not. He could attack with the Displacer and the Catacomb Sifter, and then if Needle Spires gets activated, you could bounce the Needle Spires by flickering Reflector Mage again, and that would leave him still enough mana between the Loam Dryad and the Scion to have 1 activated ability up of that.
We'll see if Jonathan can draw his 4th and final Radiant Flames to put things back.
The Radiant Flames, the Chandra, and the 2 Atarkas are Jonathan's 2 big draws, or one of the 2 copies of Tragic Arrogance. Jonathan has a lot of sweepers in his deck. This matchup looks pretty good for him post-board. So I wouldn't be surprised if Jonathan ended up, top decking his way out of this, just because he's got so many good live draws right now. And he's got a couple turns. This isn't going well for him. He's definitely behind, but he's got a couple turns before he has to find something.
Looks like Niels might even be attacking with the Eldrazi Scion in addition to the Catacomb Sifter and the Eldrazi Displacer. We'll see if he wants to activate his Needle Spires. And he does. So I assume we'll see a Displacer flicker on the Spires.
Well, yeah, flickering the Reflector Mage is essentially that, yeah.
Oh, right, of course.
Though you can replay the Spires next turn, even though Reflector Mage's ability says you can't cast it, but just playing a land, of course, is not casting a spell. So by using Displacer on Reflector Mage, it leaves the battlefield briefly, comes back, and re-triggers its enter the battlefield effect, bouncing the Needle Spires, forcing Jonathan to either take 6 or potentially trade Deathcap Cultivator for Scion. The reason that isn't unreasonable is that it means that Niels won't be able to use his Displacer anymore.
All right, and that's going to be the play for Jonathan. Looks like Deathcap Cultivator jumping in front of the Eldrazi Scion. Niels going to get a scry here.
Ooh, Duskwatch Recruiter. That seems like a good one. It's not a Reality Smasher, but he has 2 on the bottom of his deck right now. So if you only board in 2, especially, then you can't do that much better. So one of the advantages of Duskwatch Recruiter is that it does give him an outlet for all this mana. Of course, Niels is playing aggressively and chose to put it on the bottom.
Okay. Another land draw here for Jonathan, who can only develop out the Needle Spires again. The Sylvan Advocate bounced with Reflector Mage. Oh, Westvale Abbey now.
This is good. So now Niels actually could activate Westvale Abbey. He could pay 3 to displace the Sifter, going up to 5 creatures in play the Abbey, pay 5, sack all his creatures to Abbey. That's kind of going all in a game you're already winning, so I would imagine he's just gonna make an attack here. But it is kind of interesting that he has that option.
Especially when your opponent knows, or when Niels knows that Jonathan has access to Stasis Snare and Silk Wrap. If the Ormondal would kill one shot, maybe that would be a little bit more tempting here, but
Yeah, if Jonathan was at 9, this would be a little harder. But given that Jonathan is well out of the range, or at least somewhat out of the range of one hit from Ormondal, I think setting up an Ormondal kill next turn is going to end up being better. And Niels leaving back Lone Dryad because if he flickers the Sifter, he ends up with a token and then now has 6 mana from tapping Lone Dryad in the rest of his lands.
all right, draw step for Jonathan. Not a bad one. Archangel Avacyn.
Well, not a good enough one either, unfortunately. So because of the Reflector Mage and Eldrazi Displacer, Niels is going to take this match. He's going to be able to use Displacer to clear out all potential blockers and just attack for lethal.
All right, and it looks like Niels is probably going to be flickering his Reflector Mage here in addition to his Catacomb Sifter maybe once or twice.
So the only way for Niels to not end up winning this is to be forced to flicker one of his attackers during his attack step, but I think he's going to be able to maneuver things so that he's not counting on Reflector Mage to do that.
Niels doing a little mental math here, and here we go.
Yeah, he's deciding whether he wants to flicker the Sifter first or the Reflector Mage first.
All right, Sifter going to be the flicker target. Scion produced. Lone Dryad using the newly summoned Eldrazi Scion. We are going to get at least 2 more Eldrazi Displacer targets here. Reflector Mage now. Going to bounce back the Sylvan Advocate.
And I think there's some thought to just like leaving 3 mana up just in case, but you've got to figure that Jonathan doesn't have a instant speed removal now, so Niels is just going to attack with everything and force Jonathan to have an answer, which he of course knows is not going to appear here.
And even though Archangel Avacyn could, in theory, block a creature, even if Niels let that happen, he would still be taking lethal.
And that will do it.
Looks like Niels is going to win the first 2 matches here, and he's going to take the match, and he's going to be in the finals.
Yep, Niels advances to the finals. He's got a little bit of time now to study his opposition's deck lists and try to figure out which formats he thinks they'll be battling.
Yeah, don't go anywhere, folks. That was the first semifinals here. Our next semifinals is going to be between Jerry Thompson and Alexander Ivanov. Please stay tuned for the Magic Online Championships.